speaker is Nadia Agha. Agha, yes, and she's going to be speaking. She's from the kinesiology department at Rice University. Exercise as a countermeasure for latent viral reactivation during long-duration spaceflight. I suffer for that from being a couch potato.
Thank you, everyone. So I usually am presenting this to exercise physiologists or immunologists. I will say engineers, architects are a new audience for me. So if I say something that doesn't make sense, just stop me and I'm happy to elaborate more. So this is work I did during my dissertation at U of H, and I looked at, oh, it's not working. Exercise as a countermeasure for latent viral reactivation during long duration spaceflight. Clicker's not working either. I'll just use a computer, that's fine. It's not working either. There we go. Okay. So, as we've heard earlier this morning, obviously NASA is very interested in getting us to the moon and to Mars, but one of the important things that we need to do before we get there is make sure that our crew members, our astronauts, are healthy enough to participate in their mission objectives once they get there. So one of NASA's concerns is the risk of an adverse health event due to an altered immune response. NASA has documented immune dysregulation, or the immune system not functioning as it normally does. During spaceflight, we've seen both changes in the adaptive and the immune areas of immune dysregulation. Astronauts have experienced clinical symptoms such as rashes. Our astronauts do experience some mild clinical symptoms. They usually complain a lot about rashes, congestion. They have cold sore due to viral reactivations. And of these viral reactivations, at the moment they're subclinical, and I'll talk about them more in a minute. But obviously NASA is interested. We can't have astronauts who are very sick partaking in mission objectives. So we need to find countermeasures to help protect them and keep their immune system healthy and functioning. So when we think about immune dysregulation and immune symptoms that a lot of people experience, especially after coming through COVID, we think a lot about quarantine periods. So can we take our astronauts, put them in isolation for a period of time and make sure that they haven't caught something from people in the general public, from their family members? Obviously getting things contaminated and sending them into space can also be a problem. And the issue that we have is that when we talk about some of the problems that astronauts are currently experiencing with latent viral reactivations, the issue is that these are viruses that naturally infect us as humans at some point in our life and remain. So these are called latent herpes viruses. Almost everybody in this room is going to have at least one of them. Unfortunately, I have all of them. I've been tested many times. So this is just something that we generally are infected with. These viruses come, infect us, they live in our bodies, and the idea is once we're immunocompromised because we're stressed or we're sick, these viruses reactivate and try to infect other humans. So these viruses include CMV, EBV, HSV, varicella zoster's virus, or commonly known as chickenpox, or shingles. All of these happening in astronauts can be really problematic, especially if we talk about shingles. So most of them are going to either have had chickenpox as a child or be vaccinated against it. But if this virus were to reactivate, it reactivates as shingles. And if anyone has experienced that, it can be very painful. My aunt has 3 kids, and when she had shingles, she said she'd rather have given birth to all 3 kids back to back than ever have shingles again. So for some people, it can be very painful. And for an astronaut, that could really cause some detriments to their completion of their missions. So again, usually I present this to immunologists who have a lot of background. So I'm trying here to give you a brief background about aging, stress, exercise, and how all of that impacts the immune system. So as we age, our immune system naturally weakens over time. We do know that there are some things to boost that immunity that can help prevent our immune system from aging. Some of those things include exercise and reducing incidences of stress. We have a lot of data to suggest that long periods of stress, such as bereavement, can cause negative impacts to our immune system. And positive things like exercising can prevent your immune system from aging. Exercise has a lot of benefits on the immune system, particularly with latent herpes reactivation as the astronauts are dealing with. So to go into that, when we look at exercise and how it affects immune regulation, we have a lot of data to suggest that regular moderate intensity exercise is very beneficial for the immune system. And what you see happens is that anytime an individual, any one of us in this room, starts to exercise, you have this proliferation of all of these immune cells that go out into circulation from our bodies, and they're present and they're circulating in our blood. A lot of our immune cells, some are impacted more than others. And the reason for this is you have increased heart rate, you have increased blood pressure. This essentially forces your immune cells out from wherever they're hiding in your body, out from the attaching to the blood vessels, and it forces them to go into circulation. You also have this huge influx of catecholamines because when you exercise, it's the fight or flight response, right? Our ancestors did not exercise for health reasons or for enjoyment. Their exercising back then was considered hunting and gathering, right? So this was sort of an evolutionarily preserved component where when you were hunting gathering, you could get injured. And so you needed these immune cells to go out and potentially be ready on the defense to prevent you from getting infected with whatever saber-toothed tiger you were hunting. So these cells go out into circulation. We call this immunosurveillance. So they're going out and they're looking for something that's not supposed to be there. Small COVID virus that's there, they're going to eliminate it. So these cells are out and about, they're more activated, and they're more likely to catch something early on. So when we talk about latent herpes viruses, if these viruses are replicating for whatever reason, if you're exercising, the more regularly you do this, the more likely your immune system is to catch this early on and prevent it from causing you to have symptoms. We have a lot of data that shows higher levels of aerobic fitness are associated with better viral control. So people with higher cardiorespiratory fitness, higher VO2 max, show lower titer levels for these latent herpes viruses, indicating that their body is able to keep it under control and prevent it from replicating. Our lab has also shown that exercise can mobilize viral-specific T cells. So these are T cells that are specific to these viruses. They recognize them, attack them, and control them very well. And that we know that during exercise, you mobilize these cells, and again, they're primed and ready for attack. So if they find these viruses, they eliminate them. Another component that's important to remember how that stress can impact the immune system. And spaceflight comes with a lot of stressors. Not only are you dealing with physical stressors associated with spaceflight, including microgravity and radiation, but you also have some psychological ones: isolation, time away from your family, confinement into a small vessel, if you're on the ISS, being on the ISS with your crew for up to 6 months to a year. And also the psychological stressors: if anything that goes wrong, it needs to be fixed. Otherwise, there really is a threat to your life and emergency systems that need to be activated. Astronauts also experience a lot of sunrises and sunsets when they're on the ISS, so there's a lot of circadian misalignment that can also impact the immune system. They're having altered nutrition. So all of these things are going to impact them and also affect their immune function. So when we look at how we expect spaceflight to impact immunity, we look at it on this continuum. So essentially, how long is a spaceflight mission? What can we compare it to analogs here on Earth to say, how is it likely going to impact the immune system? So initially, when we were looking at just short duration missions, shuttle missions, launch or landing, what we saw was that there was this beneficial impact to the immune system, where you essentially had more cells go out. We called it enhanced immune surveillance again. So short duration missions, you saw this increased number of immune cells, cells that were primed for attack. But as we prolong that stressor, that can cause negative impacts to your immune system. If you think of it on a non-space flight matter, you can think of it as experiencing bereavement, okay? So losing a loved one and that stress can impact your immune system in a negative way, especially when it's prolonged for months to a year. So when we look at planetary exploration missions, we're talking about missions that will last months to years, and we want to know what the impact is. So from shuttle missions, we know it's beneficial. From ISS missions, we know that we start to see decrements to the immune system, and the fear is if we prolong these missions longer, how is the immune system going to function? If it's going to be negatively impacted, again, we need countermeasures to try to rectify that. Again, with spaceflight analogs, we see that some of the stressors that we expect to happen with spaceflight, inhospitable environments, isolation, confinement, again, they all impact the immune system. So we do know that stress is having an impact on the astronaut's immune system. So can exercise also impact how an individual handles stress? And the answer is yes. And it's through this idea of allostatic load. So allostasis is this ability to achieve stability through change and a process that supports homeostasis. So essentially, every time you exercise, your body adapts to it and gets used to it. It knows what to expect, it knows what to prepare for. And we see that individuals with higher cardiorespiratory fitness actually need a higher level of a stress stimulus in order to see a hormonal response to that stressor. So essentially, if I take two individuals, one with higher cardiorespiratory fitness, one individual who exercises more, compared to another individual who's otherwise sedentary, the sedentary person will experience a catecholamine or a hormonal stress response more quickly, while the person who exercises requires a higher stimulus before they start to see a hormonal response to stressors. And so what this is telling us is that exercise could have implications for dealing with chronic stress. Individuals who exercise more regularly are going to be able to tolerate a level of stress better than someone who's otherwise sedentary. So a lot of the times, one of the things I get is, okay, Nadia, why are you looking at astronauts' fitness status? We're really dealing with a high elite level of military personnel when we talk about astronauts, which is very true. But we also have a lot of scientists going into space, okay? So they're not exercising as much, may not have the same physical fitness as some of our military-grade astronauts who are going in. On the flip side of that, when you have these military individuals who are going in, who are very fit, once we put them into a spaceflight mission, they're now going to actually have reduced exercise time, right, by being in space. So they could potentially see some negative impacts on their immune system due to lowering the levels of exercise. So we really wanted to look at how these astronauts' fitness status impacts their immune system. So again, when we look at exercise and spaceflight, it's not new. We currently utilize it as a countermeasure. It's utilized to counteract the loss in muscle mass, cardiovascular deconditioning, and also bone health. But the idea here is if we know that can also impact the immune system, can we optimize it in some way to also have an additional health benefit to us? So what we did was we, as part of a larger project, we were able to get data from NASA to determine what these astronauts' fitness status was before and after spaceflight. So my big research question was to determine if higher pre-flight fitness or maintaining fitness reduced the incidence of viral reactivation in international space station crew members. So I was able to get fitness data in 22 astronauts who completed a 6-month ISS mission. We had 17 males and 5 females. Their average age was about 49. We got pre- and post-flight fitness data. And then we also had viral DNA data from these astronauts at pre, mid, and post-flight. Again, we looked at same herpes viruses, CMV, EBV, and VZV. Essentially, if any of these astronauts reactivated any of these viruses at any point, I called them a reactivator. That'll be a term that you'll see in a second. We also had viral reactivation data from 6 ground-based controls. So these were support staff that helped with the NASA study. And what we were trying to show here is that what the typical incidence of a herpes virus reactivation is for a human here on Earth. So our experimental design, again, we had pre and mid and post-flight data. I'm not sure how familiar everyone was with these terms, but we have essentially 180 and 60 days before launch as our pre-flight measurements. At mid-flight, we had early, mid, and late, which is about flight day 10, flight day 90, and then 1 day before returning to Earth. And then for post-flight, we had data at 1 day after return and then about 30 days after return. We had fitness data from all of these astronauts. We had cardiorespiratory fitness and other functional fitness tests at 180 days before flight and then within a week of returning to Earth. One of the important things is with these latent herpes viruses, you can only reactivate it if you're infected with it. So for this particular group, this cohort of astronauts, we had 59% of them had CMV, so that means only 59% of them can reactivate CMV. The rest were 100% EBV and VZV positive. These numbers kind of match up to the normal population of what you would expect to see. And again, for our controls, we just had viral reactivation data on them. And with them, we only had 33% who were CMV positive, 83% who were EBV positive, and 100% who were VZV positive. For functional fitness tests, so these were all of our exercise measurements that we had. NASA typically screens all of these for our astronauts before they go into space. And so what we had was a submaximal cycling test to determine VO2 max, and then muscular endurance tests, including push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, strength test, which was a bench press or leg press, and flexibility, which is a sit and reach test. So these are pretty standardized military grade tests that all of our astronauts go through, and they need to pass it with the minimum criteria in order to pass and go into space. So for our analysis, essentially what I did was I stratified, I did a mean, and separated our astronauts into either higher fitness or lower fitness. I then looked at their post-flight fitness classification and essentially saw how much they deconditioned, how much they changed. Did a median split there. The astronauts who lost the most, who lost more than average, were considered to be deconditioned. Those who lost less than the average were considered to have remained conditioned. We then did chi-squared test to compare the incidences of viral reactivation in our groups. And essentially for this, I can determine relative risk of, or the probability of a viral reactivation occurring in one of these groups. So the first thing we found was that higher pre-flight cardiorespiratory fitness reduced the incidence of viral reactivation. So if we look at our two groups here in their VO2 max, and this is a normal way of just trying to determine how fit an individual is. Our higher fitness group had a VO2 max of 46, while our lower fitness group had a VO2 max of 36.7. I don't have this here, but I also want to point out that the American College of Sports Medicine has these fitness stratifications based on your age and your sex. And by these means here, our astronauts who had higher fitness fell into the 80th percentile or greater based on their age and sex. And so they were very fit compared to the lower fit group who met the criteria for flight, but were just of good fitness status when compared to their regular population. And so what we saw here was that those who had higher VO2 max showed fewer incidences of viral reactivation compared to individuals who had lower VO2 max. We had a very low sample size here, and so what I did was I combined CMV, EBV, and VZV into one, and so that was our main statistic. There is some clinical significance to this. If you reactivate 3 viruses versus 1 or 2, it obviously has more symptoms associated with it, so we do feel that this is clinically relevant. But again, what we see here is that most of this is being driven by astronauts showing fewer incidents of viral reactivation for EBV and VZV. When I look at their post-flight fitness classification, so again, I did a median split based on how much VO2 max astronauts lost upon returning to Earth. And what we saw was that our astronauts who remained conditioned lost only about 3% of their VO2 max. So they did a really good job of maintaining their fitness status while they were in space. Those who were deconditioned lost about 17.5%. So a substantial amount of fitness was lost just during their 6-month ISS mission. Again, here we just saw trends here that people who remained conditioned were less likely to have a viral reactivation compared to those who became deconditioned. The next thing we looked at was higher pre-flight upper body muscular endurance reduces the incidence of viral reactivation. So here we looked at pull-ups and push-ups. So individuals who had higher fitness for pre-flight pull-ups and push-ups, they saw similar benefits here. If you were of higher fitness classification, you had a lower incidence of shedding a virus. Again, mostly driven by EBV and CMV. We also got additional data here to show that our astronauts who had higher fitness also showed fewer positive test samples. So every time we swabbed them, they just had fewer swabs that came back positive. And the total amount of viral DNA that we detected in these samples was also less. I should also point out that for most of these, because they didn't reactivate, these zeros are really kind of driving this response here. So to be fair, it's really due to the individuals who did not reactivate. The next thing we looked at was at what point did these astronauts start showing their viral reactivation? Because it's not uncommon for us to see immune system dysregulation beginning as soon as the astronauts know that they're going into space. So 180 days before they're actually taking their spaceflight mission, some of them are already pretty stressed and showing some immune dysregulation. And what we found was that individuals who had higher fitness status they essentially were able to keep that virus from replicating longer. So if they shed later on in their mission compared to individuals who had lower fitness status. So if you had lower fitness status, you were more likely to reactivate your virus either before flight or immediately at the very beginning of your spaceflight mission. And one of the things I want to point out here is our controls are described here. So all 6 of our controls, none of them shed any of their viruses during that time. So typically, a healthy individual here on Earth doesn't typically shed a lot of herpes virus. We didn't see any effects on viral reactivation for any of our other functional fitness tests, either at pre-flight or post-flight. So it's really driven by higher cardiorespiratory fitness, and then upper body muscular endurance. So my big question after this was, okay, we know that having higher cardiorespiratory fitness before flight is good. We also see trends that maintaining your cardiorespiratory fitness is important. Is one more important than the other? And so I was able here to split our pre-flight fitness groups into 2 classifications. Half of them in each group either maintained their fitness and while the other half became deconditioned. So what I did was I stratified them into those 4 groups, and what we see here is that our astronauts who had lower pre-flight fitness going in and lost the most fitness while they were in space, they reactivated every virus they could have. So what this data kind of shows us, again, being really driven here by EBV and VZV, what this data shows us is that we think that this means that either one is good. So either going into spaceflight with higher cardiorespiratory fitness is going to be beneficial, or maintaining your fitness is going to be beneficial for keeping your immune system functional. So the next big question we saw was, well, what's going on? Why are these astronauts being deconditioned? So we, again, split them into our 4 groups. And what we see here is that those who had higher fitness, despite whether they remained conditioned or became deconditioned, they exercised for the same amount of time. Same thing could be said for the low fitness group. So what this points to us is that we can't just look at how much time an individual is exercising. We really have to get into the weeds and look at how intensely are they exercising. So getting on a treadmill and walking is not the same as jogging or running. And so to us, this points to NASA that we really need to monitor this a little bit more, monitor heart rate, make sure these astronauts are actually exercising at the intensity that they need to be, because it can really benefit their immune system. The ARAD is the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device here, so this is resistive exercises that astronauts can do. We didn't see any differences there, so we didn't really look at it. Okay, so in conclusion, we see benefits associated with higher cardiorespiratory fitness and upper body endurance on reducing the incidence of viral reactivation. And what we attribute this to is better viral control. So astronauts who are more fit have likely partaken in exercise for a long period of time before their spaceflight mission, and so they're more likely to have these viruses, despite being infected with them, under better control even before they go into space. Our astronauts who are able to maintain their aerobic capacity means that they likely exercised while they were on the space station. And so what they're seeing here is the same thing that you have on Earth. So every time you exercise, your immune cells are still very likely going out into circulation and causing this enhanced immunosurveillance that we see here on Earth. So that same phenomenon we think that is happening here on Earth is happening in space. Unfortunately, due to logistical constraints, it's really hard to get a post-exercise blood sample from an astronaut and get it back down to Earth in time for us to process it. But idea is that it's probably what's happening here on Earth is very likely still happening on the space station. So our recommendations to NASA was that our astronauts need to have a pre-flight VO2 max. So based on their age and sex, they need to follow into one of the American College of Sports Medicine's fitness norms of the 80th percentile or greater. Or once they're in flight, they need to maintain whatever VO2 max that they have. So exercise physiologists need to be able to prescribe them an exercise intensity and make sure that they're able to achieve that while they're on the space station. Excuse me. Also having above average performance on pull-ups and push-ups would also be beneficial. So the biomolecular mechanism of why having higher upper body muscular endurance affects the immune system is a great question. There, to us, is no logical reason why particularly the upper body would cause benefits to the immune system. But generally speaking, individuals who have this ability to do pull-ups are usually very fit. This is a really good indicator of, it correlates really well with how much exercise an individual does and how well they are able to maintain a good and healthy body composition, which is very likely why they're able to have higher than normal pull-ups than push-ups. We did not see any benefits associated with greater strength or flexibility in any of our other markers. So really just cardiorespiratory fitness and upper body muscular endurance. Okay, and that's all I have for you guys. I just wanted to thank everybody in my team. This project was at least the viral reactivation part was a 6-year project with my team where we were getting blood samples from NASA at whatever time our astronauts were returning to Earth. So sometimes that was 2 a.m. We were all in the lab processing blood samples. So my team here, I'd like to thank them, and obviously all of my mentors that I had. We would not be able to do this without all of our immunologists down at NASA for helping us through the study process and the logistics. So thank you so much.
We have time for a few questions. Yes.
I'm really fascinated by the strength building versus the aerobic, the push-up and pull-up versus the aerobic issue. And I'm wondering, did you look specifically at high-intensity interval training? In other words, that might, I know that push-ups and pull-ups are high intensity, but they're not necessarily spurts of aerobic activity followed by. Did you look at that high-intensity interval training as something that, as opposed to something that's just strength building?
That's a great question. And one that I think the field is still arguing about whether or not it's beneficial to the immune system. We have limited studies on it, and what we have found essentially is that the amount of time that you spend in those high-intensity areas are really what's beneficial to the immune system. So if you think about the length of the enhanced immunosurveillance that you see, that seems to really drive it. I don't recall any studies on the top of my head about HIIT training specifically, but we do know that a lot of strength training, which can cause an increase in heart rate, but not to the same extent as cardiorespiratory exercises or aerobic exercises, they're not the same. They don't show the same immune benefits. They don't show the same immune response as aerobic exercises. So I really think it's more of a length of time and the intensity of the exercise.
I was curious about slide 7. It showed like this peak of immune system response, and then it falls off.
Oh,
What does it mean? You exercise too much, you screw yourself, basically, what?
very good question. So when the field first started, it was really driven by this right here.
Yeah.
So in the early 90s, a lot of people were saying, well, hey, a lot of our elite our elite athletes, they're having these symptoms of upper respiratory tract infections more often. It's because of this. And then we spent the next 20 years studying it. And what we found was that just because we can't measure these cells doesn't mean they're not out doing something. So these cells are not necessarily in circulation, but they're somewhere in our body where we can't capture them by a needle, and they're out doing something. So see if I can better answer this question. People who engage in moderate intensity exercise usually see benefits. So despite having this period of time in which there's not as many cells circulating in the body, we think that they're going out and taking care of problems that somewhere in the body, whether in the muscle or in our tissue. So they're just not actively in circulation. Now, on the flip side, if you engage in a lot of intense exercises and don't give your body enough time to recover, these tend to be really elite athletes. So we're talking Olympians, people who are spending 8+ hours a day exercising. Their career requires them to exercise. Those individuals essentially see this period prolonged, and that long duration stress essentially can impact their immune system, where they do see immune dysregulation. But I do also want to preface that with saying, yes, they do see things, and it's usually just mild symptoms of upper respiratory tract infection. So very mild, but for that particular group, those mild symptoms do impact them, right? So if you have an Olympian who keeps getting this cold, they can't train, they can't perform optimally, it becomes a problem for them. So there is a large field of exercise immunologists dedicated to the elite athletes and their immune function.
I have a question. You thought, what is the future for people that are physically challenged? that won't be able perhaps to actually exercise as they're.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, what is the future for travel for people that are physically challenged, that may not be able to exercise, while they're on a flight or whatnot?
Yeah, there are definitely, I mean, it depends on how physically challenged you are. There are different ways to exercise and sort of cause this enhanced immunosurveillance to occur. So we can do that with arm crank exercises. Obviously, for a lot of people, this field can lead to drug development. How do we mimic the physiological response to exercise in a pill, for lack of a better word. And so that is also an option. I'm not sure that we can really replace exercise, but people are definitely looking into it.
Any more questions? Thank you.